Fiore.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for staying here and sticking with the permitting panel, which at this time, we all know permitting is one of those things that we're all trying to figure out as we go along. We have a great panel here, and this panel is going to discuss, namely, what has happened or could maybe happen better at the federal level. We've got Brian for that, with offshore wind permitting in particular, especially given that we have changes in administration every 4 years. And then our California team here is going to talk about what they do and how they see their role during the next 3.5 or so years, preparing for the next administration, if you will, and how permitting can proceed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their organization, agency, and what they're here to talk about. So, Amy?
Hi, my name is Amy Vierra. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the California State Lands Commission, and I'm sort of the coordinator for offshore wind. I've been there for about 2 years. Just a little bit about the commission. State Lands Commission is primarily a land and natural resource management agency. So similar to a landlord, we issue leases for the use of the state's public trust land. The commission manages 4,000 leases, ranging from things like recreational and industrial piers, to oil and gas facilities, marinas, hotels, you name it. We have a really wide portfolio. And public trust lands encompass tidelands, submerged lands, and navigable waterways at the time the state was admitted into the union. And in the context of offshore wind, the most important being that this extends from the shoreline out to the 3-mile state-federal boundary. So we're governed by a 3-member commission, and all decisions are made at publicly held meetings. And in the context of offshore wind, we have 2 primary responsibilities. The first is to be the lead agency under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and that was mandated through SB 286. And the other is that we're the leasing entity for the component parts of the projects that are in state waters, so things like export cables. We do also have permit authority over geophysical and geological surveys, and we do retain oversight authority over granted lands, and I'll explain later what that is. But getting back to CEQA, this is not new for us. We have a whole team of folks who work on CEQA and have a lot of experience with projects that span the state-federal boundary. And again, leasing is not new to us either. The commission makes its decisions whether the project is consistent with the public trust doctrine, whether it's in the best interest of the state, and whether it's compliant with our tribal consultation and environmental justice policy. And again, we've done leasing on fiber optic cables and oil and gas. So thank you.
Joe?
Hi, folks. I'm Joseph Street. I am the manager of the Energy, Ocean Resources, and Federal Consistency Unit at the California Coastal Commission. So many of you may be aware of the Coastal Commission. We are California's coastal zone management agency on the outer coast. We operate under the California Coastal Act, one of the classic 1970s environmental laws. And our purview is essentially to balance development with coastal resource protection within the coastal zone, which overlaps largely with the State Lands Commission's purview on the coast, extending out to the 3-mile state waters boundary. And then we also have jurisdiction over portions of the onshore areas, extending a variable distance onshore. So one of our primary roles is direct permitting of development and spanning all sorts of development types. Relevant for this meeting, if you are seeking to put export cables on the seafloor in state waters, you'd be coming to us for a coastal development permit. But another huge chunk of our work is focused on working with local governments in the coastal zone on coastal land use planning. Example of that might be when your cable reaches the shore and you want to bring it to tie into existing transmission infrastructure, you may be seeking a coastal permit from the local government, who would be reviewing that under the policies that the Coastal Commission has previously certified. I should mention that we operate under a 12-member commission, and one of whom, Commissioner Wilson, is here today. So if you see him, say hello and thank him for his work. But one of the unique aspects of the Coastal Commission is that we also have review authority under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. And so we do what we call federal consistency review over federal agency activities, for instance, leasing of offshore wind areas. And we also will also review projects that require federal agency permits or licenses that have the potential to affect the coastal zone. And so that would include offshore wind energy areas occurring in federal waters. So our consistency review is not a veto. It's a chance for our commission to determine whether a project is consistent with the policies of the Coastal Act, and then work with the federal government and with project proponents to achieve consistency where needed. So it's inherently supposed to be a collaborative process. Many of you may be aware that when BOEM did its initial leasing offshore of Humboldt and Morro Bay, the commission reviewed consistency determinations for those projects. And that has led to our current phase of the work. We're still a long ways away, several years at least, from any actual construction or operations plans that would lead to development of these leases. And so our focus now is very much on upfront planning and coordination with with the different stakeholders, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit.
Thank you. Awbrey?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Awbrey Yost, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Schatz Energy Research Center. Schatz does a variety of research on clean and renewable energy, and we work a lot with partners. Our research is really collaborative, so we work with a lot of tribal nations, with other researchers, with consultants, and we like to coordinate with agencies as well. Our research is also very applied. We really like to work on questions that are likely to have a direct impact on our communities. In the offshore wind space, Schatz does a variety of research, more technical and engineering research, as well as research on economic and workforce development, and policy and regulatory issues, among other research. The Schatz Energy Research Center is housed at Cal Poly Humboldt University. We're based in Arcata, and we're also part of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, or POWC, as we like to call it. And POWC is a joint effort by research centers at 3 universities, Cal Poly Humboldt University, which includes Schatz, Cal Poly SLO, San Luis Obispo, and Oregon State University. And the goal of that consortium is to do research and workforce and professional development, and also knowledge exchange with host communities and tribal nations in the areas where offshore wind will be developed in California and Oregon potentially in the future. My position at Schatz is a relatively new position, and I think it's an indication of some expansion of our capacity to do more research on policy, legal, and permitting issues. And so I look forward to continuing the research.
Thank you. Brian?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Krevor. I'm the Senior Director for Offshore Environmental and Permitting at the American Clean Power Association. This month will be 2 years with ACP. Prior to that, I was with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Office of Renewable Energy Programs for 12 years, doing environmental permitting and reviews for offshore wind. And while I was at BOEM, my primary role was the NEPA team lead, so a lot of NEPA work, but also did work on area identification, leasing, and planning processes as well, the environmental side of that. So the American Clean Power Association, we are a pan-tech renewable energy trade association representing solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, battery storage, and green hydrogen. And on the basic level, we advocate for the interests of our member companies on multiple levels, both federal and state, and in Congress. But we also serve as a kind of a central hub for coordination and planning among our members. So in the offshore wind sphere, I host a biweekly meeting of permitting experts for all the companies where we tackle some of the most important issues, whether it be trying to create more efficient permitting or trying to tackle some challenging environmental issues and coming up with joint ways to research and handle them, because it's much better to tackle issues on a regional scale or on an industry scale than a project by project scale. So the trade association allows all of us to do that together. And this is also true for the West Coast leases. My colleague Molly, who's here today, she helps coordinate for the Seven Seas Working Group among our members, and the East Coast version of that I help coordinate. So that's kind of the role that I play at ACP in the offshore wind industry.
Thank you, Brian. And I can attest to the fact that Brian, in his days at BOEM, have seen a few administrations come and go, and he's been through some of these ups and downs already. So I'm going to ask my first question of Brian. Do you think you could provide an overview of what is happening at the federal level with respect to offshore wind permitting? And, I think we've thrown around this term perfect permitting quite a bit, and maybe give us some insights as to how it could improve, how maybe it's not done so hot in the past.
Sure. As most of you know, a presidential memorandum was issued on January 20th, pausing all offshore wind permitting, also withdrawing all areas temporarily, in quotes, from leasing for offshore wind. And there's supposed to be an assessment being done while permitting is paused. That presidential memorandum has been also used to go after some projects that have been fully permitted. So it's although on its face it's supposed to be just for projects that are still in the permitting process, it's been used against certain projects that had all their federal permits. So it's a sea change from the previous administration, and there has been a recent lawsuit by a lot of state attorney generals on the East Coast challenging that presidential memorandum. So we'll see where that goes, but for now the permitting is paused for all offshore wind projects, which one of the things we're going to talk about today is what opportunities that gives us. It's not really the opportunity we're looking for, but there is some advantages of having time to think through some of these processes, and really when doing that, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the East Coast, both good and bad. And I think it's key to try to take the good lessons and leave the bad lessons behind. The timelines for permitting were just way too long. And when there is this kind of dichotomy between administrations that we haven't seen in the past, having permitting that goes too long, that bleeds into a new administration that could be hostile to the technology is very challenging for developers to work with. It creates a ton of uncertainty and makes it difficult to invest. kind of the irony and tragedy of this is that offshore wind is the most regulated marine industry in the country and one of the most regulated industries in the country. And I think folks on all sides of the aisle are trying to make offshore wind be everything to everyone, a perfect new industry. But it is a new industry, and it has to be given time to grow, and it can't be burdened greater than every single other industry. And for example, we have mitigation measures that are addressing things that aren't really helping the species. What needs to be done is mitigation measures that are tied to actual impacts and that will make a difference in actual environmental protection. Right now, you have crew transport vessels traveling at 10 knots with 2 protected species observers out to projects, getting passed by cargo vessels and cruise ships with 0 protected species observers, and they're going 30 knots. Does that actually protect the North Atlantic right whale? No. No measurable protection, but extreme safety challenges for offshore wind crews on those vessels, and extreme costs and time delays. So a burden for the industry that doesn't actually protect the species they're trying to protect. So that is what we really need to avoid, and I think where the West Coast can really learn from the mistakes of the East Coast and the burdens that's being placed on it. So, and we're going to talk more about this later, but when trying to change the lens from federal permitting to state permitting and the state processes, is the state has an opportunity to be complementary of the federal process and not be duplicative, and not just putting on more measures that build upon existing measures, but rather trying to fill in gaps where the federal process isn't the best, and where it's led to some areas where there's room for improvement. And this is key because in 4 years from now, hopefully there will be a more friendly administration, and then things can start to pick up pace again, and companies are going to be deciding whether it makes sense for them to invest in the United States and invest in offshore wind. And if the processes that are being put in place now are good and are robust but enable the industry to have certainty, then it makes that investment decision easier. But if it's another layer of regulatory burden on top of what is already an extremely burdensome permitting process, that makes it more difficult to invest and have that certainty. And we all want to see this industry succeed. So it's imperative upon us to put the right kind of permitting regime in place to make that happen.
Thank you, Brian. That is a great segue to talk about specifically what California can do in this next 3.5 or 4 years, during this time period before there is an administration change, and hopefully it'll be a little more friendly at the federal level to offshore wind. And I think we're going to pivot a little bit from offshore to talk about infrastructure that needs to happen here in California at the state level, and how we can proceed with some of that is completely necessary for a successful offshore wind deployment in the state of California. Awbrey, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Whitney. I'm going to focus on permitting for staging and integration projects, which are port development projects that we've heard about today. Those are the projects that allow for the staging, assembly, and integration of floating offshore wind turbines before they're towed out to sea and deployed. There's other kinds of port development projects that need to happen for offshore wind development to occur, like operations and maintenance facilities. And a lot of those projects will have very similar permitting processes as staging and integration projects, but there'll be some differences too. So I'm going to focus, though, on staging and integration projects because that's one of the really fundamental types of infrastructure that needs to be built before offshore wind farms can become operational. These are projects that are largely within the state of California's and local governments' permitting control. There are also projects that are complex to permit for a number of reasons. They're located in in bays and ports that are in the coastal zone and that are on granted public trust lands, which each have their own unique regulatory requirements. These projects are also really massive in scale, which has the potential for significant environmental and community impacts that need to be thoroughly considered in the permitting process. And just the number of agencies that have jurisdiction over these projects can make it complicated. So last week, we at the Schatz Center published a report that identifies the permitting and planning processes that will need to occur for these staging and integration projects to be permitted and built. And we found in that report that these projects are likely to require up to 20 different authorizations from federal, state, and local agencies. And that permitting timeline is likely to be about 3 to 4 years after environmental review begins. And that 3 to 4 years timeline is a very optimistic timeline that doesn't account for things like extensions of deadlines that are available or appeals. So it's very possible that the timeline will be longer than that. In terms of where are we today, we heard Suzanne earlier today talk about one project in the Port of Long Beach that's been proposed. There's another staging and integration project that's been proposed by the Humboldt Bay Harbor District in Wiggy or Humboldt Bay. And both of those projects are currently undergoing environmental review. The Port of Long Beach is the lead agency under CEQA for their project, and the U.S. Army Corps is the lead agency under NEPA for that project. And the Army Corps and the Port of Long Beach are both working on developing a draft joint environmental impact report / environmental impact statement that I believe is supposed to be released later this year. For the Humboldt Bay Harbor District project, the Harbor District is the lead agency under CEQA. The U.S. Maritime Administration is likely to be the lead agency under NEPA for that project. The U.S. Maritime Administration, also known as MARAD, hasn't issued a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement yet. So it seems likely that those could be on different environmental review timelines for the CEQA and NEPA potentially. So that's kind of where we are today for staging and integration port development projects. In terms of next steps, there are many authorizations that need to happen. I'm going to touch on 2 key permitting processes that Joe and Amy are going to talk about more as well. The first is under the California Coastal Act, getting a coastal development permit. That'll be required for both of these projects, and that might be issued by the Port of Long Beach, most likely, if it gets a Port Master Plan Amendment certified by the Coastal Commission. And in the case of the Humboldt Bay Harbor District's project, that coastal development permit is likely to be processed by the California Coastal Commission. But these projects are complex because you need a coastal development permit, but in a lot of times, local governments or port governing bodies will have to amend their planning documents as well, like their port master plans. And so it can be a multi-step process. These projects are also located on granted public trust lands, like Amy referred to, which means that in this case, the Humboldt Bay Harbor District and the Port of Long Beach are likely to issue authorizations to allow for activities on those granted public trust lands. So there's a lot of complexities. Those are 2 of the key permitting processes that are going to look more holistically at these projects. I'll just mention very briefly, there has been recent legislation, SB 286, which did change some of the permitting requirements for both of those, for coastal development permits under the Coastal Act and for leases and authorizations on public trust lands for offshore wind energy projects. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Joe to talk a little bit more about each of those processes.
Yeah, if you guys don't mind, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to speed this up if we want to get to our questions.
Yeah, I think I can be really brief because Awbrey gave a really good overview, and I just wanted to plug the Schatz Energy Center report. I think it did a really, really great job. So just to highlight maybe two things that Awbrey didn't mention is, yeah, she was talking about the staging and integration ports, but this issue about granted lands and local jurisdictions managing granted lands, that is true of nearly every port in California. So the same framework will be true of a operation and maintenance port or a manufacturing fabrication port. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is State Lands Commission entered into an MOU with the Port of Long Beach and the Humboldt Bay Harbor District last December, and that was really focused on cooperation and collaboration. There were quite a few points in that MOU, things like developing zero emission strategies or tribal consultation, and all with the effort or with the goal of trying to have these ports be responsibly, equitably, and sustainably developed. So I'll leave it there.
Joe?
Sure, thank you. Amy, you're very gracious. I was going to complain that Awbrey stole my material, but just kidding. No, without taking up too much time, I would just add that I think the Commission's really aware that ports in particular, because of the regulatory complexity, have the potential to really slow things down. So we are trying our best, because we do share jurisdiction with local governments and ports, to coordinate up front. And, we're doing this in a variety of ways. We're lucky enough to get some additional funding. So we've hired 2 port specialists to work with us, both in Long Beach and Humboldt Bay. But we're coordinating with the Port of Long Beach on their PLP amendment. Nothing slows down a project like an appeal, so we're trying to work out the issues ahead of time before that amendment with new policies goes to our commission. Likewise, in Humboldt, we'll be sharing permitting jurisdiction with the Harbor District, and we will be exploring potential for consolidated permits. And we're participating on interagency working groups. Gosh, the cursed word, working group. And it won't be the last you hear of it. But to try to get ahead of the significant issues that, with regard to coastal resources that come up with these large port projects.
All right, well, I think this is a good time for us to talk a little bit about what is happening at the state level in particular with respect to moving these projects, not moving permitting forward, let's call it that, the permitting process forward that will allow the projects to proceed, and when federal permitting comes around again, to be prepared for that. Like what California is doing specifically to be ready for that. Amy, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So, I think the most significant thing that we did was the AB 525 strategic plan, and kudos to the Energy Commission for leading that effort. When that was underway, they also started what's now called an Offshore Renewable Energy Tribal Working Group. And that group has been meeting for about 2 years now. We meet roughly every 2 weeks, and it's been a really great forum. State Lands Commission, as the California Environmental Quality Act gets underway, will start assuming more of those responsibilities as the CEQA lead agency. And AB 52 has some specific requirements around tribal consultation. But I think we've kind of built some relationships now, and so we certainly want to do the best we can, and with respect to tribal consultation. And then another group that we haven't, this panel hasn't yet talked about, is port adjacent communities. So again, AB 525 roadmap really provided a dialogue. And then the MOU that I just mentioned a little bit ago, we had a lot of discussions with environmental justice and port adjacent communities that really helped us to understand their concerns. And so we meet with these groups on a monthly basis. I think it's the Coastal Commission, State Lands Commission, and Energy Commission. And then, you know, as AB3 is implemented, I think that's going to be another really important forum to understand port adjacent communities' perspectives.
Joe?
Yeah, thank you. So I hate to use the word silver lining at a time like this, but I think we do have a little bit of an opportunity here at the state level to kind of lay the groundwork for a robust and efficient permitting process when the time comes.
You mean non-perfect California permitting?
Non-perfect, of course. But, you know, if we have the time, we should use it wisely, is I think the theme. And, you know, I think one of the prime examples for the Coastal Commission is in the area of kind of trying to plan for the coexistence of the fishing industry and offshore wind. And at the time when the commission reviewed the leasing in the offshore wind areas, you know, one of the big potential stumbling blocks that was identified was, you know, potential for conflict between these two industries. So under the commission's review, and also under SB 286, we were tasked with convening a fisheries working group that brought together developers, representatives from the commercial and recreation fishing industries, as well as state and federal agencies, with the task of coming up with a statewide strategy to, you know, ensure the coexistence of these industries. The key components of this strategy, which is in progress right now, and hopefully wrapping up towards the end of the year, would be a set of best practices for avoidance and minimization of impacts to fisheries, a methodology for assessing socioeconomic impacts, which is really key if we're going to talk about mitigation. And finally, a template agreement for compensatory mitigation for those impacts that can't be avoided or minimized. And, you know, the details of that are very much under discussion. It's been a lot of work, and you know, the participation and, you know, earnest contributions from both industries has been absolutely fantastic. But we're looking at some combination of direct compensation and resiliency. So TBD. I'll let it go now.
So Awbrey, I think this is a really good moment to segue to some of the conversations that I've had with leadership at the state level, also with Bone Pacific folks, is, you know, the science and the data gathering and that whole process, and how maybe there can be some consensus on how that's done and what we can do, again, in preparation for 4 years from now when federal permitting may start up again in California. Do you want to talk about what you are all doing over there at Schatz?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've been thinking a lot about what to be doing in the next few years during this time, and what opportunities there are. One priority that we've been thinking a lot about is the importance of research on port infrastructure and transmission infrastructure that needs to be built for offshore wind farms to be operational. These are projects that are going through the environmental review and permitting process more sooner than the next stage of the offshore wind farm permitting. So it's important to be understanding the impacts and all of the, trying to understand what the implications of those projects might be in the near future. Another reason that those are projects that it would be helpful to be researching and thinking about is that those are projects that are primarily within the state's purview for permitting, unlike offshore wind farms. And so that's really an area that we're prioritizing. And when I say we, I'm talking about Schatz Energy Research Center and PAUSI also. Another research area that we think is helpful to be prioritizing is research that'll have a broader applicability. And so that can include research that helps us better understand our ocean and bay and coastal ecosystems, and that can apply in different contexts as well. So for example, Sarah Hinkle, I think, is here at Oregon State University, who's part of PAUSI and is doing some ecological research on cable laying as part of the PacWave wave energy project in Oregon, which will have some real implications for offshore wind in California. And lastly, another research priority that we've been thinking about is those open questions on the impacts of offshore wind farms and potential mitigation and monitoring strategies. So last month, the Schatz Center published a report on seabird vulnerability seabird vulnerability for collisions with wind turbines. And that was a work that was done with other partners, but that's an example of some of those questions that we still need to answer before offshore wind farms are operational. And one of the key questions for this time, when we have more of an opportunity to do research, is how that'll be resourced or funded with the pullback of much federal funding. And I think it's a tough question, but one we'll have to be thinking about.
Thank you. From the state perspective, data, science, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So as the CEQA lead agency, we are thinking about this quite a bit, about what we and other agencies need. And it's probably worth mentioning that many of the natural resource agencies meet in a group convened by the Ocean Protection Council every other week. So we have, and we've been doing that for quite a long time. We're trying to do our homework and understand what's going to come into us in a very detailed way in the construction and operation plan. And under the Biden administration, there was an understanding that State Lands Commission and BOEM would undertake joint CEQA NEPA documents, but to my knowledge, that hasn't been yet brought up with the Trump administration. So we'll have to see what happens. But it's likely that we'll form a multi-agency joint review panel for the preparation of the CEQA document, and we hope this will facilitate early involvement and create efficiencies. One thing that we did together, the state agencies, was we wrote one single response letter to BOEM's draft programmatic environmental impact statement. And that was really helpful just to kind of understand each other's concerns, as well as just understand better the state of the science. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is with funding from the Ocean Protection Council, there's a group led by the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation who's convened something like 270 scientists working on 5 different working groups on what they're calling the Environmental Monitoring Guidance Project. And this is going to identify the baseline data that we need, the questions that we should ask in order to really be able to assess the impact of offshore wind projects. So we're really looking forward to the results of that project.
And before we turn to Joe, the joint review panel, would that also include tribal nations?
You know, I am not a CEQA expert, so I'm not sure that I can answer that question. We definitely have obligations under AB 52 to do consultation. And our past executive officer who left us about 6 months ago, and I would suspect our incoming executive officer to be named, Tribal consultation has always been something that has been really important to our agency. We have a policy, so I suspect that we would want to engage tribal governments to the greatest extent that we could.
I have been asked that question by tribal members in the past. That's why I brought it up. So, Joe, you want to go?
No, I would just add that the state's also in the process of developing a West Coast Science Collaborative for offshore wind that I believe is the topic of a panel later this afternoon.
I believe that is correct. Well, it looks like we have about 4 minutes left, and what I was thinking, Brian, if maybe you can help close us out from the federal perspective. What is California doing, that's you see as helping move offshore wind permitting forward in this pause, if we'll call it at the federal level, and if there's anything else you would recommend?
Sure. I think what you heard today from California is really what I was speaking to earlier about being complementary of the federal process. There was a Government Accountability Office report that came out that was requested by the House Natural Resources Committee of Congress, and it highlighted a few areas that the federal permitting process could improve upon. And one of them was tribal capacity building, tribal community outreach, and implementing more of their concerns, addressing them better and earlier, and also similar with the fishing community. And I think what you've heard from California is they are focused on those issues. And so, and I believe the state is a little more agile and better equipped to deal with some of those, and those issues need to be dealt with early in the process. They're time intensive and resource intensive. And so for these 4 years, those are some really great areas for them to focus on. And the federal government certainly has a role in those, and a unique government-to-government responsibility for tribal nations. But I do think the state can really complement the process with their own efforts, and they seem to be doing that and focused on it. So I think that's a really good start.
And Awbrey, I think you have something to add about tribal engagement that we talked about during our panel prep.
Oh, sure. I'll just add that the report that we released recently identifies the tribal consultation requirements for those key permitting processes for under the California Coastal Act and for public trust lands, as well as for CEQA and NEPA environmental review.
Well, and I know in your neck of the woods that the tribal nations are very engaged in offshore wind and all things really marine. So it's really great that you guys are up there doing the good work you're doing. There's a couple of audience questions. We have very little time left. There is one about, are there lessons learned in permitting and how to coordinate permitting from Europe? And the short answer is not really, because in Europe, typically, France is a country, and you have one permit application for the country of France for an offshore wind farm. You don't have 20 different authorizations and states wanting certain things and the feds wanting certain things. So it's a very, very different process in Europe. Just the permitting there is just very, very different. Also, in Europe, oftentimes the projects are actually led by the state, if you will. So they are managing the process and titling the process for a project that is under their purview. There was one more question that I thought our panelists could answer if our tech people could move. There we go. Yeah, this one I have no idea. I don't know if any of our state people or Awbrey, since you just finished that report, is there any streamlining bills at the legislature that are being considered to help speed up permitting for the port projects or other infrastructure?
I'll just mention SB 286, which we already talked about, but which is specific to offshore wind energy projects. And there is a portion of SB 286 that requires the Coastal Commission to process a consolidated coastal development permit when a offshore wind energy project, or almost any project related to, associated with, appertinent to, or needed for offshore wind energy is proposed. If that project is both within the Coastal Commission's permitting authority and within the permitting authority of a local government with a local coastal program. So that kind of consolidated permitting process is likely to apply in the project in Wiggy or Humboldt Bay. But that legislation likely doesn't apply in certain other circumstances for offshore wind energy related projects. And we've got more discussion about that in the report. And I'm also happy to talk.
So it sounds like we need another bill. Well, our time is up here, and so I really wanted to thank everyone, this great group of panelists. Thank you for being up here and talking through, what is very much a challenging time with permitting. So a round of applause for our panelists, please.